Last week saw Michael Schumacher celebrate his 55th birthday, so with that in mind, I thought it was about time that I did a video on him because after all, he is my favourite driver. And I thought for this video I would actually specifically focus on my favourite Michael Schumacher moment. Now you're probably thinking it's probably going to be something from his Ferrari career where of course he won most of his championships and had all of his success. So you're probably thinking Suzuka 2000, Hungary 1998, or Spain 1996. But no, you're wrong actually, because my favourite Michael Schumacher moment came during his 3-year comeback with Mercedes, specifically when at 43 years old he put his Mercedes on pole position at the Monaco Grand Prix in 2012. So let's talk about it. Now this obviously gives us an opportunity to look back on the 2012 season, which at this point after 5 races really had turned into an absolute cracker. We'd had 5 races and 5 different winners at this stage of the season. We'd had Jenson Button winning the first race of the season in Australia, followed by Fernando Alonso winning in Malaysia. Then Nico Rosberg took his first ever Formula 1 victory in China. Then Sebastian Vettel won in Bahrain. And then to top it all off, Pastor Maldonado gave Williams their first victory for 8 years when he won the Spanish Grand Prix. I think for many of us we regard 2012 as the greatest Formula 1 season of all time simply because of how competitive it was and you didn't know what was going to happen race by race. And at this stage of the season, after 5 races, it meant that the championship was extremely close. So this is how the championship looks. Sebastian Vettel and Fernando Alonso were tied at the top on 61 points, with both of them having taken a victory each, but Vettel had better results. Lewis Hamilton sat 3rd in the standings despite having not won a race. Kimi Raikkonen on his return for Lotus was 4th in the championship on 49 points. And Mark Webber sat 5th also despite having not won a race on 48 points. One thing you will notice is that Schumacher's name is nowhere to be seen, and that's because he was way down the championship order, having scored just 2 points in the opening 5 races due to a rotten run of bad luck and a few mishaps along the way. So let's look at a summary of Schumacher's performances in those first 5 races. At the first race in Australia, he actually qualified on the 2nd row in 4th place, which at that time was his best qualifying position during his 3-year comeback with Mercedes. And he was actually running well in the top 3 during the early part of the race. But then on about lap 11, his gearbox packed up and he was forced to retire, costing him what surely would have been a solid points haul to start the year. And then in Malaysia, he again qualified well. This time he went 1 place higher in 3rd place. But then on the opening lap, his race was ruined when he was tipped into a spin by Romain Grosjean. And then he was left trying to fight his way back through the field for the remainder of the race. And he managed to only get back into 10th place to score 1 World Championship point. The bad luck continued into round 3 in China, where he had managed to qualify this time on the front row behind his teammate Nico Rosberg. But then during the race, while running in a comfortable 2nd place behind Rosberg, he made his first pit stop, and at the pit stop the Mercedes mechanics failed to fit one of his tyres properly to the car, which meant that when Schumacher rejoined the race, you could immediately feel that there was a problem with the car and was forced to pull over to the side of the track and having to retire, costing him what surely would have been a podium on that day. Then at the next race in Bahrain, he had problems in qualifying with a DRS issue, which meant that he qualified down in 17th place and then was hit with a 5-place grid penalty, having taken new engine components. But he managed to put in a solid drive during the race, where he managed to work his way through the field and finish again in 10th place, just like he did in Malaysia. And then at the Spanish Grand Prix, Schumacher was involved in an incident with Bruno Senna when he ran into the back of the Williams driver at turn 1, when Bruno had sort of been weaving a little bit in the braking zone as they approached the corner, but had done nothing out of the ordinary, done nothing against the rule book. But Michael was kind of caught out by Bruno's sudden movements and ran straight into the back of him, taking them both out of the race in the process. And although Michael immediately came on the team radio and blamed Bruno for the incident, the stewards deemed him at fault for the incident and handed him a 5-place grid penalty for the next race in Monaco. Now at this stage, Michael was in the 3rd year of his comeback to Formula 1 with Mercedes, having rejoined the sport in 2010. But things had not gone to plan, certainly not as well as his first career, when he of course had all of his success and won all of his world championships. But at this stage, he had clearly been outperformed by his teammate Nico Rosberg over their 2.5 years as teammates. Rosberg clearly had the upper hand in 2010 and 2011. It was him that was getting the big results, the podiums, whereas Michael only had a few minor highlights, which were a run of 4th places over those 2 years. It's fair to say that Michael had come under a lot of criticism during his comeback for not performing at a level that he had been expected to do. there were many that were saying that he was now past his best and was never going to be the same driver that he was during his first career. After all, he was 43 years old at this point. And those that were saying that his comeback was a mistake maybe did have a point, because at this stage, once again, he was being outperformed by Rosberg. Rosberg was well ahead of Michael in the championship. He had 41 points to his name and crucially had one victory, taking Mercedes' first victory since it came back to Formula 1 in 2010. But nevertheless, there was a lot of optimism at Mercedes that they could be competitive in Monaco. After all, their car was expected to suit the circuit, given that it had been competitive in Monaco for the past 2 years, in 2010 and 2011, where both Michael and Nico had qualified in the top 10 at both of those events. And sure enough, Mercedes were quick in practice. They were right at the top end of the timesheets. But out of the two Mercedes drivers, it was Nico that looked the faster of the two, having finished ahead of Michael in all 3 practice sessions. And he also managed to finish top of the timesheets in FP3 on the Saturday morning just before qualifying. So going into that qualifying session, it was Nico that had the upper hand on Michael and looked the safer bet to put the Mercedes right near the front of the grid. But during this qualifying session, this is where Michael started to strike back. Michael managed to finish in the top 5 in both Q1 and Q2. In Q1, he narrowly beat Nico's time, with Nico Hülkenberg topping the session for Force India, followed by Kamui Kobayashi for Sauber, Romain Grosjean and Sebastian Vettel. In Q2, it was Felipe Massa that surprisingly set the pace, with Rosberg following home in second place, managing to get the upper hand on Michael this time, albeit just by 4/100ths of a second. Pastor Maldonado, the winner from the last race in Spain, was third, with Mark Webber in fourth. So both Mercedes drivers had safely made their way into the top 10 shootout, and they generally did have a shot at taking pole position. But if we're being honest, generally any one of that top 10 could have taken pole on that day. It was extremely close between all of them. It was simply going to come down to who would be able to absolutely nail the lap around the most difficult street circuit on the Formula 1 calendar. As Michael's final attempt was coming together, it really did look as though he was going to be able to put himself in a position where he would be in contention to fight for pole position. But the trouble for him is that he would have to try and beat Mark Webber's provisional pole time, which did look extremely quick and was going to be quite a tall order to beat. But Michael was absolutely flying. He put in a purple time for the middle sector. All he needed to do was complete a clean final sector, and he may well have a chance of pipping Webber to that pole position. And sure enough, as he came across the line, he did just that. P1 came up on the timing screens. Schumacher had done it. He had taken pole position from Webber by just 8/100ths of a second. Not only had Michael managed to get the better of his teammate Rosberg, but he managed to get the better of everyone, and it was his 69th pole position. But sadly, it would turn out to be the 69th pole position that never was, because of course it wouldn't sadly count, as he had that 5-place grid penalty carrying over from Spain. So that meant that he would have to start the race from 6th place. When you look back at this lap, I think it's got to go down as one of Michael's greatest ever qualifying laps that he produced during his career, because it was just so breathtaking to watch and just so impressive, particularly the way that he's going through some of the corners one-handed while adjusting the brake bias. The car on that particular day just looked so effortless to drive. It really was handling the bumps and the Monaco corners extremely well, so maybe it isn't too much of a surprise that Michael did manage to stick it on pole position that day. But nevertheless, you cannot take away from the fact that on that particular day in Monaco, Michael Schumacher was the fastest driver in qualifying, and I think he absolutely proved all of the doubters, all of the critics that he'd had during his comeback about his performances not being up to scratch, that he still had everything that had made him great over his successful career in Formula 1. Although the pole position did not count, it did give us those fantastic scenes when he was driving back to the pits, having clearly been told by the team that he put in the fastest time during that qualifying session. And so to see him pointing his finger at the sky, taking in the adulation of the crowd, it was fantastic to see, especially as it had been a long time since Michael had delivered that kind of performance. But what was funny to me looking back is that during the build-up to the race, that Michael was really building up expectations that he and Mercedes were going to be competitive in Monaco. In fact, in the build-up to the weekend, he quite clearly said that he was going to be fastest in qualifying, taking the pole position. He would then start P6 because of the grid penalty, and then he'd go on to win the race, which of course, sadly, he did not, because of course, he suffered yet again more bad luck with mechanical issues, which saw him retire from the Grand Prix, having run in 7th place. When I look back at how Michael's race panned out after being fastest in qualifying, I always think I'm quite glad that he actually didn't end up starting from pole position, because could you imagine how disappointing it would have been, how heartbreaking it would have been if he'd been leading the race from pole position and then he'd suffered that mechanical retirement about 10-15 laps from the end. That would have cost him a first victory since China 2006, that would have been just horrible to watch. So for that reason, I'm glad that he actually ended up starting from P6. Even if Michael's run of bad luck would continue over the next couple of races, it would finally pick up and his form would get a lot more consistent and a lot better, and he would be rewarded with a lot more points finishes, including what would turn out to be his 155th and final podium at the European Grand Prix in Valencia, when he finished in 3rd place. And then of course later in the season, Michael decided he was going to retire from Formula 1 for the 2nd time. But I'm glad that Michael at least managed to go out on a relatively high note, even if the stats show that 2012 was his worst season since his debut back in 1991. At least we have moments like Monaco to look back on, as Michael proving all of the doubters, all of the critics that had said his comeback with Mercedes was a mistake. That at 43 years old, on that particular day in Monaco in qualifying, Michael Schumacher was the fastest driver in Formula 1.